The storm did not announce itself gently. It arrived with a violence that felt intentional, as if the sky itself had decided to rupture all at once, sending rain down in heavy sheets that blurred the city into a smear of light and shadow. Liam was at home, alone with the hum of a lamp and the half-finished quiet of a night he had hoped would end uneventfully. He had been thinking, as he often did lately, about balance, about how fragile it felt, about how every effort to protect it seemed to stretch him thinner rather than make him stronger. When his phone rang, the sound cut through the room with an urgency that made his chest tighten before he even looked at the screen. He answered without thinking, already standing, already bracing himself for something he could not yet name. The voice on the other end was professional, practiced, and devastating in its restraint. The hospital informed him that Hope had been brought into the emergency room following a serious accident. The words serious injuries were spoken carefully, as if cushioning them might soften their impact. Liam barely heard the rest. His body reacted before his mind caught up, keys in hand, door slamming open, rain soaking through his jacket as he ran toward his car. Fear stripped him down to instinct. Every rational thought dissolved into a single, relentless need to get to her, to see her, to undo whatever moment had led to this call. The drive felt unreal, the world outside his windshield distorted by rain and speed. Traffic lights blurred into streaks of red and green, and every second felt both elongated and insufficient. His mind replayed fragments of recent conversations, moments he had dismissed as ordinary, Hope rubbing her temples after a long day, Hope insisting she was fine when her eyes told a different story, Hope pushing herself to be present everywhere, for everyone. Guilt began to seep in alongside fear, a quiet whisper that maybe he should have seen this coming, that maybe he had mistaken resilience for invincibility. At the hospital, the fluorescent lights were merciless. Liam burst through the doors, soaked and shaking, his breath uneven as he demanded information he was not yet ready to receive. A nurse guided him to a waiting area, her expression sympathetic, but guarded. The word emergency became a static buzz in his ears as he paced, hands clenched, mind unraveling. When a doctor finally approached, Liam searched their face for hope before any words were spoken. What he found instead was gravity. Hope was alive, the doctor said, but her injuries were severe. Internal trauma. Complications. The phrases were clinical, precise, and devastating. And then came the sentence that changed the shape of everything: she had lost the baby. The words landed with a force that knocked the air from his lungs. Liam felt his knees weaken, felt the world tilt as if the ground itself could no longer be trusted. He had imagined pain, fear, even permanent change, but this was something else entirely. This was absence. This was a future erased in a single, irreversible moment. Hope lay in the emergency room, her body bruised and broken, her face pale against the sterile white of the sheets. Machines beeped steadily around her, indifferent to the devastation they framed. She drifted in and out of consciousness, the edges of reality blurred by pain medication and shock. Somewhere beneath the haze, she sensed that something was terribly wrong, that something precious had slipped away from her grasp. When she finally became lucid enough to understand, the truth settled over her like a weight she could not lift. The baby was gone. The life she had carried with such hope and determination was no longer part of her body, no longer part of the future she had been fighting to preserve. The knowledge hollowed her out. Pain radiated through her physically, but it was nothing compared to the ache blooming in her chest, a grief so profound it felt endless. She closed her eyes, tears sliding silently down her temples, and turned inward, searching for something to blame, something to anchor the chaos. In those moments of fragile clarity, Hope's thoughts turned cruelly inward. She replayed the months leading up to the accident with ruthless precision. The long hours. The pressure. The constant need to prove that she could handle everything, that she could be a devoted partner, a committed professional, a symbol of integrity and optimism in an industry that thrived on competition. She remembered insisting she could manage it all, brushing off concerns, telling herself that strength meant endurance. Now, lying broken and empty, she wondered if that belief had cost her everything. The decision to terminate what remained of the pregnancy was not framed as a choice, it was presented as necessity. The doctors explained it gently, explaining the risks, the lack of alternatives. Hope listened, numb, the words washing over her without fully landing. When she finally nodded, consenting to the procedure, it felt like a betrayal layered on top of loss. She blamed herself for surviving when the baby had not, for pushing her body beyond its limits, for believing that love and effort could bend reality into compliance. Liam sat by her bedside when he was finally allowed in, his hand wrapped tightly around hers as if sheer will could keep her tethered to the world. He tried to be calm, to be supportive, to be the steady presence she needed. But beneath that surface, something volatile churned. Grief did not arrive alone, it brought anger with it, sharp and directionless at first, then gradually honing itself into suspicion. The accident, he realized, did not make sense. The details were vague, the explanations incomplete. A late night. A stretch of road. Weather conditions. All plausible, all insufficient. As Hope slept, Liam's mind worked relentlessly, searching for a narrative that could contain his pain. And slowly, inexorably, his thoughts drifted toward the pressure she had been under, the warnings he had heard but dismissed. Steffi's voice echoed in his memory, uninvited and unwelcome. She had warned him, more than once, that Hope was pushing herself too hard, that the demands of work and the emotional toll of ongoing conflicts were taking their toll. At the time, Liam had bristled at the implication, reading it as criticism disguised as concern. Now, standing in the aftermath of devastation, those words returned with a different weight. They felt less like interference and more like prophecy. Anger found its target. To Liam, the line between circumstance and culpability blurred rapidly. He began to see the accident not as an isolated event, but as the inevitable consequence of a system that had demanded too much and offered too little protection. And in that system, Steffi stood as both architect and enforcer. She represented the pressure, the expectations, the relentless pace that had driven Hope to exhaustion. Rationality struggled to survive under the weight of grief, and Liam's pain demanded somewhere to go. When Steffi learned of the accident, shock hit her with an intensity she did not expect. For all the tension, the history, the unresolved resentment between them, she had never wished harm on Hope. The news of the miscarriage landed like a blow to the chest, dredging up memories she kept carefully compartmentalized. Loss had a way of collapsing time, of dragging old wounds back into the present without permission. But sympathy did not shield her from blame. Liam confronted her with raw, unfiltered rage, his words sharp and unforgiving. He accused her of creating an environment that had crushed Hope under its weight, of prioritizing ambition and control over human cost. He reminded her of her warnings, twisting them into accusations. If she had seen the danger, why hadn't she done more? If she had cared, why had she allowed the pressure to continue? Steffi absorbed the accusations with a rigid stillness that masked the turmoil beneath. Part of her recoiled, defensive and indignant, refusing to accept responsibility for something she had neither caused nor controlled. Another part, quieter and far more dangerous, wondered if there was truth buried beneath Liam's fury. She had pushed. She had enforced standards. She had believed, fiercely, in resilience as a measure of worth. Had she mistaken endurance for health? Had she underestimated the toll of constant strain? The conflict between the Forrester and Spencer families escalated rapidly, fueled by grief, anger, and long-standing fractures that had never fully healed. Conversations turned confrontational. Support fractured into sides. Every interaction carried an undercurrent of accusation, as if tragedy itself demanded a culprit. What had once been professional rivalry now felt personal, existential, and impossible to de-escalate. Hope, waking to this storm of blame and bitterness, felt overwhelmed by guilt. She heard fragments of arguments through hospital walls, sensed the tension in the way people spoke around her, and internalized it all as evidence of her own failure. She believed, with a devastating certainty, that her attempt to hold everything together had instead torn everything apart. In her mind, the loss of the baby was punishment, proof that she had asked too much of herself and everyone else. Liam's love for her did not waver, but it warped under the pressure of his grief. His need to protect transformed into a need to control outcomes, to assign responsibility, to make sense of a world that had suddenly revealed itself as indifferent and cruel. He told himself that anger was action, that blame was a form of justice. But in quiet moments, when the hospital room dimmed and hope slept, doubt crept in. He wondered if his rage was less about accountability, and more about his own helplessness. Steffi, meanwhile, retreated into calculation, her instinctive response to emotional chaos. She refused to engage in public arguments, choosing instead to maintain composure, to project stability even as her private world shook. She mourned in silence, not only for Hope's loss, but for the widening chasm that now threatened to swallow any possibility of understanding. She knew that if this conflict continued unchecked, it would consume more than just relationships, it would reshape legacies. The storm outside eventually passed, leaving behind wet streets and heavy air. Inside the hospital, time moved differently, measured in heartbeats and lab results rather than hours. Hope began the slow, painful process of recovery, both physical and emotional. The absence inside her did not fade, it settled, becoming a constant presence she would have to learn to carry. She questioned everything she had believed about strength, about sacrifice, about what it meant to fight for a family. She wondered whether love required endurance or restraint, whether ambition could coexist with care, whether the systems she had trusted were capable of protecting those within them. These questions did not have answers yet. They lingered, heavy and unresolved. The tension between the Forrester and Spencer families did not dissipate with the rain. It hardened, shaped by grief and mistrust into something more enduring. Each side believed themselves justified, each convinced that the other had crossed an unforgivable line. What had begun as an accident now threatened to redefine alliances, loyalties, and the future itself. And beneath it all, the unspoken question remained, haunting every conversation and every silence: was this tragedy truly an accident, or the inevitable result of a world that demanded too much and listened too little? No one had the answer yet. But everyone, in their own way, felt its weight, pressing down on them like the memory of thunder long after the sky had cleared. Eric had never imagined the word retirement belonging to him. It felt foreign, almost insulting, like a garment cut for someone else's body and forced onto his own. For decades, his life had been measured not in years, but in collections, sketches, fabrics pinned to boards, and the quiet, sacred moments when an idea became something tangible under his hands. Forrester Creations was not merely a company he founded, it was the physical extension of his identity, the proof that passion could be disciplined into legacy. And yet, in the cold clarity of recent weeks, that identity had been challenged, redefined, and ultimately pushed aside in the name of survival. The conversation with Ridge had not been gentle, despite Ridge's insistence that it was necessary. It unfolded like so many father and son confrontations before it, layered with love, resentment, fear, and an unspoken competition for control. Ridge spoke of responsibility, of risk, of medical realities Eric had grown tired of hearing framed as inevitabilities. He spoke of the future with the authority of a man who believed he was protecting both a company and a parent, even if that protection felt suspiciously like exile. Eric listened, silent and rigid, absorbing every word while privately resisting the conclusion Ridge seemed to have reached long before the discussion ever began. When Brooke joined that conversation, her presence complicated everything. She tried to soften the edges, to frame the decision as a celebration rather than a removal, as an evolution rather than an ending. She spoke of honoring Eric's legacy, of ensuring he would always be revered as the visionary founder. But to Eric, reverence without relevance felt hollow. He did not want to be admired from a distance, he wanted to create. He wanted to work. He wanted to wake each morning knowing that his hands still mattered. The argument escalated, voices rising not out of cruelty, but desperation. Ridge finally said what Eric had sensed all along: continuing at his pace could cost him his life. The words landed with a brutal finality. They were not meant to wound, yet they did, because they framed Eric not as a man choosing his limits, but as a liability that needed to be managed. In that moment, Eric understood that the decision was no longer his alone. The company he had built was now large enough to decide that it no longer needed him at its center. Reluctantly, painfully, Eric agreed to step down as lead designer. He told himself it was temporary, an experiment, a pause rather than an ending. He even admitted, out loud, that perhaps he should embrace the change, that rest might bring clarity. But acceptance spoken aloud did not translate to peace within. The agreement felt coerced, wrapped in concern and logic, yet undeniably forced. And that sense of being pushed aside lingered, coloring everything that followed. It was that lingering bitterness that drained the joy from what should have been a season of celebration. Eric found himself avoiding gatherings, avoiding congratulations, avoiding the well-meaning questions that all circled the same truth. He skipped Liam and Hope's wedding not out of indifference, but out of restraint. He did not want his presence, heavy with unspoken grief, to overshadow a day meant for beginnings. He recognized, with a sadness that surprised him, that he had begun to remove himself from moments he once anchored. As Christmas approached, the annual Forrester celebration loomed like a test he did not feel prepared to take. For years, the holiday party had been his domain, a space where family, business, and tradition merged seamlessly. It was where boundaries softened, where rivalries paused, where the weight of the year could be set down, if only briefly. This year, however, Eric felt no ownership over the event. The house felt different, the rituals altered by an absence no one quite knew how to acknowledge. There was talk, quiet but persistent, that the guest list might change. Some invitations might not be extended. Lines that had once been flexible were now rigid, drawn not just by loyalty, but by ideology. Eric sensed that his retirement had shifted the balance in ways no one had fully anticipated. What had been framed as a protective decision had become a catalyst, reopening old fractures between the Logans and the Forresters that had never fully healed. At Forrester Creations, the impact was immediate. With Eric no longer designing, the pressure to fill the creative vacuum intensified. Thomas felt it acutely. He had stepped away from design under the weight of personal reckoning, but Eric's departure stirred something deep within him, a sense of obligation to the family legacy that refused to stay quiet. Designing was not just a profession for Thomas. It was an inheritance, one he feared might be diluted or lost entirely if left unclaimed. Meanwhile, Brooke and Ridge assumed greater control, formalizing leadership structures that placed them at the helm. Eric's decision to hand over the company solidified a new era, one that elevated certain voices while marginalizing others. Steffi, fiercely protective of her position and her vision for the future, found herself in an increasingly complex power struggle. The title of co-CEO was no longer secure by default. It was something that had to be defended, negotiated, justified. For the Logans, Eric's retirement felt like an opening. Brooke stood firmly within Forrester Creations, her influence undeniable, yet even she could sense the shifting terrain beneath her feet. Katie, in particular, felt the change as confirmation of what she had long suspected, that her contributions were undervalued, her loyalty taken for granted. She had given years to the company, yet when power consolidated, she remained on the periphery. The frustration that had been simmering finally reached a boil. Katie's consideration of leaving Forrester Creations was not impulsive. It was the result of accumulated disappointment. Spencer Publications, with Bill's backing, offered something Forrester never fully had: recognition without condition. Bill's proposal of a fashion house was not just a business opportunity, it was validation. It told Katie that her vision mattered enough to stand on its own, free from the shadow of a family that never quite embraced her as equal. Eric watched these developments from an uneasy distance. Retirement had not given him peace, it had given him perspective. He saw how quickly stability fractured once he stepped away, how alliances shifted and ambitions sharpened. He saw the company he built begin to resemble a battleground rather than a sanctuary for creativity. And beneath that observation stirred a familiar itch, the desire to intervene, to design, to reclaim relevance not out of pride but necessity. The irony did not escape him. The very people who had insisted he step back for his health were now presiding over a company at war with itself. Eric began to question whether removing him had truly protected Forrester Creations, or merely exposed vulnerabilities his presence had once quietly held together. He was not blind to his limitations, but neither was he ready to accept that wisdom and creativity expired simultaneously. As whispers of a new fashion war for 2026 grew louder, Eric found himself at a crossroads he had never anticipated. Katie's departure to Spencer Publications symbolized more than a career move. It represented defiance against a system that no longer served everyone equally. Bill's role as her benefactor complicated matters further, tying business rivalry directly to personal history and long-standing animosities. For Eric, the most unsettling thought was also the most tempting: the possibility of designing again, not for Forrester, but for its rival. The idea felt treacherous and exhilarating in equal measure. What better way to prove that he was not finished than to align himself with the very force Ridge had spent his life opposing? It would not just be a professional statement, it would be a declaration of autonomy, a refusal to be quietly shelved. Such a move would not merely reignite the Logan-Forrester feud, it would fracture the Forrester family from within. It would pit legacy against legacy, father against son, past against future in a way no one could ignore. Eric understood the cost. He understood the pain it would cause. Yet he also understood the cost of silence, of compliance, of accepting a narrative that cast him as complete. As Christmas approached, the Forrester home filled with unspoken tension. Decorations went up, traditions observed, but something essential was missing. Eric moved through the house like a guest rather than a host, acutely aware of every boundary newly drawn. The holiday, once a symbol of unity, now reflected division, both literal and emotional. In the quiet moments, when the noise of family and obligation faded, Eric confronted the truth he could no longer avoid. Retirement had been presented as an ending, but endings were choices, not mandates. He had been forced to step aside, but he was not required to disappear. The industry he helped shape was entering a new era of conflict, one that demanded experience as much as innovation. What lay ahead was not simply a battle between Logans and Forresters. It was a reckoning within the Forrester family itself, a confrontation between those who believed legacy should be preserved by control and those who believed it should be honored through evolution. Eric stood at the center of that conflict, not as a relic, but as a catalyst. And as the year drew to a close, one thing became clear: Eric Forrester's story was far from over. His retirement had not silenced him, it had sharpened him. And whatever choice he made next would not just reshape the fashion world, it would redefine what it meant to belong to a legacy you created, but were told to leave behind.